There were rumors that you and your ex, Jessica Simpson, ran into each other on a plane recently. Is that true?
It is true.
And what was that like?
It was strangely okay.
They say time heals all wounds. But what happens when you're suddenly trapped at 35,000 feet with the one person you haven't spoken to in over 20 years? 20 years, and the world watched Nick Lachey and Jessica Simpson build an empire on their love, only to watch it burn down under the blinding glare of the Hollywood spotlight. But just when we thought the ashes had settled, a claustrophobic mid-air encounter changed everything. What did Nick think when the two met thousands of feet from the ground? The mid-air showdown. Reunion on plane. Well, what are the odds of meeting your ex while you're traveling with your present? For 20 years, Nick Lachey and Jessica Simpson existed in entirely separate universes. They moved in different circles, raised families with different people, and built completely distinct empires. They were the ultimate relics of early 2000s pop culture, permanently linked in the public imagination, yet entirely estranged in reality. The prevailing wisdom in Hollywood was that these two would never, under any circumstances, breathe the same air again. Then came May of 2026, and a standard commercial flight to Hawaii turned a two-decade-old Cold War into an immediate claustrophobic reality. When the first leaks hit the internet via TMZ and various celebrity gossip blogs, the narrative was nothing short of explosive. The headlines painted a picture of absolute chaos at 35,000 feet. Early reports claimed that Nick Lachey had turned bright red the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, instantly recognizing the blonde woman sitting just a few rows away. Rumors swirled that an emergency seat swipe had been frantically negotiated with flight attendants to prevent a mid-air meltdown. TikTok creators quickly jumped on the story, claiming that Jessica's children were ushered to the back of the plane while her ex-husband glared from across the aisle. The internet, hungry for a throwback celebrity feud, fully bought into the drama. It was being billed as the ultimate Hollywood showdown, a bitter, high-stakes confrontation between two people who still harbored deep-seated resentment from a devastating divorce. But what actually happened inside that metal tube flying over the Pacific Ocean? The truth finally came to light when Nick Lachey sat down with Andy Cohen on Watch What Happens Live. Sitting in the clubhouse chair, Nick couldn't help but smile when the inevitable question was popped. The dramatic internet rumors, it turned out, were almost entirely fabricated. There were no screaming matches, no frantic seat changes, and no bitter glares across the first-class galley. Instead, the reality of the situation was far more fascinating, grounded, and intensely human. Nick was traveling with his wife, Vanessa Lachey, and their children. Jessica was boarded on the exact same flight, traveling with her mother, Tina, and her own family. Because of the layout of the cabin, a run-in wasn't just likely. It was mathematically guaranteed. Nick described the initial shock of realization, admitting that seeing each other after 20 years of total silence was a surreal experience. Yet, instead of retreating into hostility, the former couple chose maturity over drama. Nick confirmed to Cohen that the encounter was strangely okay, describing the brief interaction as very cordial and very respectful. Insiders on the flight later corroborated his account, noting that Nick, Vanessa, and Jessica actually engaged in a brief, polite conversation, acknowledging the sheer absurdity of the coincidence before settling in for the 6-hour journey. It wasn't a screaming match. It was a masterclass in adult boundary setting. They handled the ultimate awkward scenario with grace, proving that the passage of 2 decades can take the sting out of even the most public heartbreaks. Yet, despite the peaceful resolution, the internet's collective freakout proved one undeniable fact. the public is still utterly obsessed with the ghost of Nick and Jessica. The sheer volume of traffic generated by a simple airplane seating arrangement showed that the emotional investment in their past relationship hasn't faded one bit. But to truly realize why a simple airplane seating arrangement sent the internet into an absolute tailspin, we have to travel back to an era before smartphones and streaming, when these two were the undisputed king and queen of pop culture, the boy bander and the pop princess. To appreciate the gravity of their accidental mid-air reunion, you have to understand the sheer cultural weight of the empire Nick and Jessica originally built. The year was 1998, a time when the music industry was experiencing an unprecedented, multi-billion-dollar gold rush, fueled entirely by teenage obsession. Pop music wasn't just a genre, it was an absolute juggernaut dominating the airwaves, retail spaces, and the cultural zeitgeist. On one side of this landscape stood Nick Lachey, the square-jawed, smooth-singing frontman of 98 Degrees. Unlike their rivals who relied on heavily synchronized dance choreography, Nick and his group carved out a distinct niche based on rich, four-part vocal harmonies and a more rugged, mature aesthetic that made them staples on MTV's Total Request Live. On the other side of the pop chessboard was Jessica Simpson. Raised in Texas as a strict evangelical minister's daughter, she had been discovered singing in church choirs. When music executive Tommy Mottola signed her to Columbia Records, he intentionally envisioned a brand-building strategy that positioned her as the wholesome, virginal alternative to the explicitly sexualized images of Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. Jessica was marketed as the stunning, accessible girl next door who possessed a genuinely powerhouse operatic vocal range. Their individual worlds collided in December of 1998 at the Hollywood Christmas Parade. Sharing the exact same manager, they were introduced backstage amidst the chaotic swirl of holiday press, flashing cameras, and industry executives. For Nick, the impact was immediate and absolute. He would later recall leaving that initial introduction and telling his mother with complete certainty that he had just met the woman he was going to marry. A follow-up encounter a month later at a Teen People event sealed their fate, and the two officially began dating. It was a match made in corporate pop heaven, a real-life romance between a boy band heartthrob and a rising pop princess that sent the tabloid industry into an absolute feeding frenzy. They even recorded a romantic duet together, titled Where You Are, for Jessica's 1999 debut album Sweet Kisses, performing the ballad on daytime talk shows while looking longingly into each other's eyes as the ultimate public display of affection. Yet, behind the glossy magazine covers and coordinated red carpet appearances, the reality of navigating a high-profile relationship while simultaneously trying to launch two major musical careers began to take a severe toll. By the spring of 2001, the intense professional pressure and constant media scrutiny fractured the young couple. They officially broke up for 5 months as Jessica focused entirely on promoting her second studio album, Irresistible. But history had a dramatic pivot in store for them. The tragic events of September 11, 2001, forced a profound perspective shift for millions of people around the globe, and Jessica was no exception. Shaken by the national tragedy, she reevaluated her life and realized that her independence wasn't worth sacrificing the love she shared with Nick. She publicly wrote on her website that the tragedy made her realize she never wanted to be away from him for the rest of her life. They reunited immediately, and just a few months later in February 2002, Nick took Jessica out on a romantic boat charter in Hawaii and officially asked her to be his wife. Jessica joyfully accepted, noting that Nick had been patiently waiting for her to grow up. On October 26, 2002, they solidified their status as pop royalty, by tying the knot in a lavish, traditional Christian ceremony in Austin, Texas, surrounded by 350 guests. They had the perfect pop star romance, but neither of them was prepared for what would happen when they invited the entire world into their living room. The curse of newlyweds. The lavish wedding was supposed to be the happily ever after for the ultimate pop princess and her boy band prince. Instead, it became the prologue to a completely unprecedented experiment in celebrity transparency. In 2003, reality television was still a developing Wild West landscape. The real world had established the genre, and the Osbournes had proved that audiences loved looking inside the homes of eccentric rock stars. But no one had ever taken two young, drop-dead gorgeous, highly active pop stars at the absolute peak of their physical and commercial powers and put their fresh marriage under a microscope. Enter MTV's Newlyweds, Nick and Jessica. The original concept for the series was simple marketing. Both Nick and Jessica were facing an increasingly competitive music market where traditional album promotion was failing to move the needle. The show was envisioned as a clever, fly-on-the-wall promotional tool to push Jessica's third studio album, In This Skin, and Nick's solo debut, Solo. Neither of them, nor the network executives at MTV, had any idea that the show would instantly morph into an absolute cultural wildfire, forever changing the trajectory of their lives and inventing the template for modern celebrity reality television. Right from the pilot episode, the dynamic between the two was laid bare for millions of viewers. Audiences were introduced to a stark, often hilarious, and occasionally uncomfortable contrast in personalities. Nick was the older, meticulously organized, structurally rigid perfectionist who was fiercely protective of his financial budget and deeply concerned with practical household management. Jessica, who had moved straight from her parents' conservative home into a multi-million-dollar mansion with Nick, was completely naive to the realities of domestic life. This contrast produced the single most iconic viral moment of the early 2000s. Lounging on the couch in a pair of sweatpants, Jessica opened a can of chicken of the sea tuna, took a bite, and looked up at Nick with genuine, unfiltered confusion. She asked a simple question that would echo through pop culture history. Is this chicken what I have? Or is this fish? I know it's tuna, but it says chicken by the sea. Nick stared at her, an expression of profound, exhausted disbelief washing over his face, before flatly explaining that it was, in fact, fish. A few episodes later, she wondered aloud if buffalo wings were harvested from actual flying buffaloes. To the viewing public, this was comedic gold. Jessica became an overnight sensation, beloved as the charmingly clueless, hyper-relatable blonde bombshell. The show's ratings absolutely skyrocketed, regularly pulling in millions of viewers per episode and turning them into household names far beyond the reach of their radio singles. Jessica's album, which had initially debuted to sluggish sales, was re-released and went triple platinum entirely on the back of the show's success. They were everywhere: magazine covers, late-night talk shows, and major advertising campaigns. But as the cameras continued to roll for 3 consecutive seasons, the performative nature of their lives began to rot the relationship from the inside out. The line between a real private marriage and a highly produced television commodity completely evaporated. Crew members were permanently stationed in their home, and producers were constantly looking to manufacture scenarios that highlighted Jessica's domestic incompetence and Nick's simmering frustration. Behind the seemingly playful bickering on screen, a toxic power dynamic was quietly solidifying. Nick had entered the relationship as the older, more established star, with a string of massive boy band hits under his belt. He was accustomed to being the anchor, but Newlyweds violently flipped the script. Jessica was no longer just his cute pop princess wife. She was an international superstar, a cultural phenomenon, and the primary economic engine of their household. The small day-to-day friction points that normal couples sort out in private were magnified 1,000 times over by the editing room. Viewers began to notice a recurring undercurrent of condescension in the way Nick spoke to Jessica, a coldness that contrasted sharply with his smooth public persona. He grew increasingly irritated by her messy habits, her lavish spending, and the constant presence of her family, particularly her manager father, Joe Simpson. Meanwhile, Jessica was growing increasingly exhausted by the pressure to permanently perform the role of the dizzy blonde for the entertainment of the masses. She was a woman growing up, gaining massive financial independence, and realizing that the man she had married loved a version of her that she was rapidly outgrowing. The house they lived in was no longer a home. It was a soundstage where their real-world communication breakdown was packaged and sold as a weekly comedy. As the ratings soared to historic heights, the line between a happy marriage and a highly produced television show completely vanished, and behind the scenes, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The 2005 implosion, the anatomy of a divorce. By the dawn of 2005, the sparkling fairy tale facade of pop culture's favorite couple had completely shattered. What had begun as a playful, ratings-driving television experiment was now a toxic, inescapable pressure cooker. The unprecedented success of Newlyweds had done its job too well. It didn't just revitalize their careers, it entirely eclipsed them. The public no longer viewed Nick and Jessica as individual recording artists with distinct musical identities. They were viewed as public property, a weekly 30-minute sitcom whose characters belonged to the audience. Everywhere they went, a ravenous pack of paparazzi followed, desperate to capture even the slightest hint of marital discord on camera. Behind closed doors, the emotional cracks in their foundation had grown into deep, unbridgeable canyons. The stark shift in their professional power dynamics had become a permanent point of unvoiced resentment. While Nick struggled to find a footing for his solo musical career, watching his album slide down the charts, Jessica's star had completely gone into orbit. She wasn't just a pop singer anymore. She was an American obsession. The definitive turning point arrived when Jessica was cast as Daisy Duke in the blockbuster film adaptation of The Dukes of Hazzard. The role required her to move to a film set in Louisiana for months, effectively removing her from the shared home and the constant presence of Nick. For the first time in their marriage, Jessica was entirely on her own, operating outside the shadow of her husband's watchful, perfectionist eye. The media coverage surrounding the movie was intense, hypersexualized, and relentless. Tabloids immediately filled the vacuum with aggressive rumors of behind-the-scenes infidelity, linking Jessica to her co-star Johnny Knoxville. While both parties vehemently denied the allegations, the public gossip added an unbearable layer of stress to an already fracturing relationship. When Jessica returned home after filming Wrapped, the distance between them was palpable. She was no longer the naive, dependent girl who didn't know the difference between chicken and fish. She was an independent, financially dominant woman who had realized her own individual power. Nick, conversely, felt increasingly alienated, pushed to the margins of his own life by the overwhelming presence of Jessica's massive entourage and her intensely involved family. The playful bickering that had defined their television show morphed into a heavy, suffocating silence. The situation finally reached its breaking point in the late fall of 2005. Following weeks of intense media speculation, The couple released a joint statement on November 23, 2005, officially announcing their separation. They claimed the decision was the mutual result of two people simply growing apart. But the subsequent legal proceedings revealed a far more complicated reality. When Jessica officially filed for divorce in December 2005, citing irreconcilable differences, the legal battle shifted from the emotional realm to the financial one. Because they had married as young, idealistic pop stars, they had committed the ultimate Hollywood sin. They had not signed a prenuptial agreement. At the time of their wedding, Nick was arguably the higher earner, but by the time of their divorce, Jessica's net worth had completely eclipsed his, driven by her film salary and the explosive early launch of her retail merchandise line. The division of assets became a protracted, agonizing process. Legal teams back and forth for months over the millions of dollars at stake. Under California law, Nick was legally entitled to half of everything earned during the marriage. Rumors circulated that Jessica's father, Joe Simpson, had desperately offered Nick a massive multi-million-dollar buyout settlement to walk away quietly without touching her future empire. Nick refused the initial lowball offers, and the final settlement eventually saw him walk away with a significant portion of their shared fortune. Jessica would later describe handing over that massive check as one of the most painful, humiliating lessons of her adult life. By the time the divorce was officially finalized in June of 2006, the dream of Nick and Jessica was dead. The papers were signed and the dream was dead, leaving two young celebrities to completely rebuild their lives under the glare of the Hollywood paparazzi. In his own words, versus her open book, The Revisionist History. The end of a marriage usually marks the beginning of silence, but for Nick and Jessica, the finalization of their divorce was simply the opening bell for a 2-decade-long media war of words. For years, the public had only the heavily edited footage of Newlyweds to piece together why pop culture's favorite young couple had imploded. But as the initial shock of the split faded into history, both parties began using the media to reshape the narrative, offering wildly different, highly calculated perspectives on what actually happened behind the closed doors of their shared Calabasas mansion. This wasn't a standard celebrity breakup. It was a decades-long struggle for historical revisionism, with each fighting to claim the mantle of the true victim. The first major opening salvo in this silent war came directly from Jessica in February of 2020, with the release of her explosive, deeply personal memoir, Open Book. Up until that moment, the prevailing public consensus had largely painted Jessica as the flighty, demanding pop princess whose lack of domestic maturity had driven her grounded husband to the brink of exhaustion. Her memoir violently flipped that narrative on its absolute head. In the book, Jessica pulled back the curtain on an entirely different dynamic, portraying Nick not as a patient, stabilizing anchor, but as a deeply insecure, hyper-controlling partner, whose ego simply could not handle her meteoric rise to superstardom. She detailed the suffocating reality of feeling constantly judged by him, noting that his passive-aggressive condescension eroded her self-worth on a daily basis. Most painfully, she addressed the toxic financial fallout of their unprepped divorce, explicitly detailing the humiliation of having to sign away a massive multi-million-dollar chunk of her early retail earnings to a man who, she claimed, had mentally checked out of the relationship long before the legal papers were drafted. Her book reframed the entire relationship as a cautionary tale of a young woman being financially and emotionally drained by a partner's deep-seated professional jealousy. Nick, for his part, chose a path of calculated, defensive avoidance that spoke volumes through its sheer omission. For years, he largely refused to engage directly with the specific, highly damaging allegations laid out in Open Book. Whenever he was pressed by reporters or daytime talk show hosts during promotional tours, his response remained fiercely protective of his own peace, flatly stating that he had not read the book and had absolutely no intention of ever doing so. Yet, despite his public claims of total indifference, Nick couldn't help but let his true, lingering frustrations slip through the cracks of his glossy television persona. While hosting the reality dating show The Ultimatum on Netflix alongside his second wife, Vanessa, Nick took a sharp, unprovoked jab at his past life, openly counseling contestants by warning them that a highly publicized, high-profile divorce leaves permanent, deep-seated emotional scars that take decades to truly heal. It was a rare, unfiltered admission that the fallout from his 3-year marriage to Jessica was still actively reverberating through his emotional landscape, long after he had built a completely new life. This ongoing public tug-of-war created a fascinating, deeply polarized landscape for fans who had grown up watching the couple on MTV. To those who sided with Jessica, Nick was the ultimate villain of her early life, an insecure man who tried to stifle a burgeoning business mogul because his own boy band glory days had passed. To Nick's defenders, Jessica's book was an unfair, highly sensationalized act of public character assassination, designed to sell copies by dragging a man who had long since moved on and stayed silent out of respect for his new family. The two separate public narratives existed in a state of permanent tension. A cold war of words played out across book tours, red carpets, and late-night talk show couches. Every time one made a comment about marriage, trust, or past heartbreaks, the media immediately connected the dots back to the other, ensuring that neither could ever truly escape the gravity of their shared pop culture past. For 20 years, they fought a silent war of words through books and talk shows, which brings us right back to that fateful, claustrophobic cabin on the way to Hawaii. Parallel lives. Where are they now? To witness Nick and Jessica crossing paths in 2026 is to look at two entirely different blueprints for navigating post-divorce life in the public eye. When their marriage officially dissolved in 2006, the consensus was that their identities were so profoundly intertwined that neither would ever fully escape the shadow of the newlyweds phenomenon. Yet, over the course of the next 2 decades, they built two separate, highly successful parallel universes that rarely, if ever, overlapped. They didn't just move on. They completely redesigned their lives, finding love, building families, and establishing massive financial empires on terms entirely their own. Nick Lachey chose a path defined by stability, institutional show business, and a highly synchronized secondary chapter. In 2006, shortly after the divorce papers were finalized, Nick cast a young television personality named Vanessa Minnillo to star in the music video for his solo single, What's Left of Me, a song explicitly written about the emotional wreckage of his split from Jessica. The on-screen chemistry quickly translated into a real-world romance. Nick and Vanessa tied the knot in 2011 in a lavish, televised tropical wedding, subsequently welcoming 3 children: Camden, Brooklyn, and Phoenix. Professionally, Nick pulled off one of the most successful pivots in modern reality television history. Instead of running away from the genre that had previously fractured his personal life, he leaned directly back into it, transitioning from a vulnerable reality participant to an authoritative, polished master of ceremonies. Alongside Vanessa, Nick became the face of Netflix's massive unscripted dating empire, hosting global cultural juggernauts like Love is Blind and Perfect Match. This professional evolution redefined Nick in the modern zeitgeist. To a younger generation of viewers, he isn't the boy band singer from 98 Degrees or the frustrated husband from MTV. He is the stable, smoothly professional patriarch of modern streaming television, anchoring a highly visible, united family unit. Jessica Simpson's trajectory, conversely, was far more turbulent, wildly unpredictable, and ultimately profoundly lucrative. Rather than seeking a comfortable, predictable niche within the Hollywood ecosystem, Jessica took the financial lessons of her unprepped divorce and transformed herself into a retail powerhouse. The Jessica Simpson collection, spanning footwear, clothing, fragrance, and home goods, matured into a multi-billion-dollar empire, proving that her business instincts far outmatched her early, manufactured television persona. At one point, her brand was generating over $1 billion in annual retail sales, cementing her status as one of the most successful celebrity entrepreneurs in history. Her personal life, however, continued to face intense, unrelenting public scrutiny. In 2014, she married former NFL tight end Eric Johnson, with whom she shares 3 children, Maxwell, Ace, and Birdie. For a decade, they appeared to be the picture-perfect, ultra-wealthy California family. Yet behind the scenes, Jessica was quietly fighting deeply personal battles. She spoke with radical candor in her memoir about her multi-year struggle with alcoholism and prescription pill dependency, ultimately achieving sobriety in 2017. Her physical appearance became a permanent, toxic talking point for the tabloid media, which obsessively documented her dramatic weight fluctuations. The stability she fought so hard to maintain faced its greatest test when she and Eric Johnson officially separated in January of 2025 after 10 years of marriage. Entering her mid-40s as a single mother of 3, Jessica chose to lean into a complete personal and professional renaissance. In early 2026, she shocked her fan base by debuting a dramatic brunette makeover, permanently shedding the signature blonde pop princess locks that had defined her identity since 1998. She explicitly told media outlets that she was ready to step back into the dating pool, focusing heavily on her independence and preparing to release new music through a Nashville-based record label. 2 completely different paths, 2 entirely separate empires, yet destined to forever be linked by a 3-year marriage that defined a generation. The final verdict on a 20-year legacy. The sudden, mid-air convergence of Nick Lachey and Jessica Simpson brings a bizarrely poetic closure to a relationship that originally defined the blueprint of modern celebrity culture. For 20 years, the internet operated under the assumption that these 2 titans of the early 2000s were locked in a state of permanent, radioactive animosity. The gossip industry fed off the narrative of an endless Cold War, weaponizing every memoir chapter, talk show jab, and passive-aggressive reality television quote to keep the ancient drama on life support. We, as an audience, were conditioned to expect fireworks, dramatic showdowns, and explosive media exposes whenever their names were mentioned in the same breath. Yet, when gravity and a random airline ticketing algorithm finally forced them back into the exact same room, the resulting explosion never actually came. The reality of their modern reunion wasn't a sensationalized tabloid battleground. It was a quiet, profoundly mature testament to the simple passage of time. By handling an intensely awkward, 6-hour travel coincidence with mutual respect and basic human dignity, Nick and Jessica effectively dismantled 2 decades of toxic public mythology. They proved that while the internet never forgets a heartbreak, the real human beings behind the glossy magazine covers eventually grow up, move on, and heal. The great exposure recently wasn't a dark secret or a hidden scandal unearthed from the ashes of their past. Instead, it was the comforting revelation that time really does take the sting out of even the most public, devastating wounds. Nick and Jessica will forever remain the undisputed king and queen of an iconic, unforgettable era of pop culture history, permanently linked by a chaotic 3-year marriage that helped birth the modern reality television landscape. But as that flight safely touched down in Hawaii, it became undeniably clear that the ghosts of their past have finally been laid to rest. They are no longer the fractured characters of an MTV reality show. They are simply two completely separate, highly successful adults who shared a brief, polite nod to the wild journey that brought them here. Give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and if you want more, simply subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.